For braving this weather, this soggy weather. You know, we are reminded that it is National Poetry Month and that it's also the cruelest month. So there you go. So anyway, we are really fortunate tonight in celebration of National Poetry Month to have Shanta Gander, our local storyteller, author, raconteur, and hello, newest select board member, to come and grace us with her poetry, her words, and her performance of Lucy Terry Prince, who is one of our homegrown, hometown literary luminaries. So many of you know Shanta already, and if you don't, you'll definitely know her by the end of the evening. So let's have a big hand for Shanta.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm told not to stand too close to the speaker, so bear with me. So I'm here to introduce to you Lucy Terry Prince, but before I get into that, I'd like to let you know that the introduction to Lucy Terry Prince and many other lesser-known voices is through the People's Places in the History of Words project, which includes several groups, including the Brattleboro Literary Festival and Marlborough College. We meet once a month, and we're working on ultimately setting up a words tour, so a tour of words, so that you'll be able to listen to podcasts and kind of see some of the voices and hear some of the voices, because we have a huge history of words in print in this area. So that's some of what we work on. And if you're interested, you can join me for the Lucy Terry Research Pod if you'd like. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the way that writing and poetry is a lens of witness. So I share a few quotes just to sort of put Lucy Terry Prince in context, not as a black poet, not as a female poet, but as an author, an orator in her own right among a pantheon of other authors and poets. So the poet is the priest of the invisible. That's Wallace Stevens. I'm a big fan of quotes. I really liked this one for so many reasons from Lucille Clifton. I think we're beginning to remember that the first poets didn't come out of a classroom. That poetry began when somebody walked off of a savanna or out of a cave and looked up at the sky in wonder and said, ah, that was the first poem. Now, I appreciate that because there is such a tension between training and craft and the it factor and the inspiration that one draws from within themselves. And as we see in a little bit, the inspiration that came from Lucy Terry happened to be a massacre. And that's a bit grim, so my apologies. So Lucy Terry Prince, bearing witness and the endurance of voice. So some of the questions I'll be asking throughout the presentation will largely be talking about the ways in which witness, like how does witness work? How do we play role as witness? What is our responsibility as witness? And also comparing that with Lucy Terry Prince and how she bore witness even while she was a slave. So those are some of the questions that we'll have a chance to discuss towards the end of the presentation. So I want to share with you just a few examples. Again, I really try to stay away from Lucy Terry Prince as the black poet, even though she does predate Phyllis Wheatley by several years, and she is, Lucy Terry Prince is the first known African-American poet that we do know of, and Phyllis Wheatley is the first one to have published a book of poetry. But again, this fits within a whole pantheon in terms of art and words and witness. So I share with you an example, and I'm going to read it to you just in case you can't see the words up there. And here's an example. Lucy Terry Prince's poem is written in heroic couplets. Also, there's a bit remnants of a ballad stanza in it, which means that it is meant to be, it's crafted to be memorized. And I'll talk a little bit about that a few slides later and why that was so important in the crafting of it. So this is just the first part of a very long poem, not Lucy Terry Prince. It's an example from the 1800s. When midnight comes, a host of dogs and men go out and track the badger to his den, and put the sack within the hole and lie, till the grunting old badger passes by. He comes and hears, they let the strongest loose. The old fox hears the noise and drops the goose. The poacher shoots and hurries from the cry, and the old hare, half wounded, buzzes by. They get a forked stick to bear him down, and clap the dogs and take him to the town, and bait him all the day with many dogs, and laugh and shout and fright the scampering hogs. He runs along and bites all he meets. They shout and hollow down the noisy streets. Now, again, it's just, and there is a question in terms of whether or not, by today's standards, would we consider this good? Because we have a different format and different way that a lot of poetry is written, and some of you, like my husband, have more expertise and could talk about the ways in which poetry has changed over the years. But you notice the rhyming and how easy it is if you were to sit down to try to memorize it. You might be able to commit it to memory, and that's very similar to what we're going to see with Lucy Terry Prince. Now, some of the other examples I give you are just illustrations of witness. So Lucy Terry Prince's poem talks about a massacre, a very specific massacre in Deerfield, Massachusetts. As we all know, poetry, especially poetry, is a lens for witnessing. So, for example, here is Langston Hughes's I Too Sang America. So again, just in case you can't see the small print, I too sang America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen. When company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table. When company comes, nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, sang America. Now, obviously, this is talking about racism and inequity and position. Interestingly enough, there's something very subtle that Lucy Terry Prince uses in her poem from her position as a slave woman at the time of the Deerfield Massacre. It's very intriguing, actually. Here's another example of Witness by Donald Justice. This came out in a collection of poems in 1995, and I'll read it to you. Get my notes. Oh, there it is. A delicate young Negro stands, with the reins of a horse clutched closely in his hands. So delicate indeed that we wonder if he can hold the spirited creature beside him, until the master shall arrive to ride him. Already the animal's nostrils widen with rage or fear. But if we imagine him snorting, about to rear, this boy, who should know about such things better than we, only stands smiling, passive and ornamental, in a fantastic livery of ruffles and puffed breeches, watching the artist apparently as he sketches. Meanwhile, the petty lord who must have paid for the artist's trip from Paraguay, for the horse, for the boy, and everything here, in fact, has been delayed. Kept too long by his steward, perhaps discussing some business concerning the estate, or fussing over the details of his impeccable toilet, with a manservant whose opinion is that any alteration at all would spoil it. However fast he should come hurrying now, over this vast greensward, mopping his brow. Clear of the sweat of the fine Renaissance morning, it would be too late. A revenge not only necessary, but right and clever. Simply to leave him out of the scene forever. So a witness witnessing the witness. Several layers of witness here. Again, the same type of witnessing of inequity, social status, class, which is a really good poem. I always mispronounce her name, so I do apologize in advance. Nozique Change is always how I've pronounced it. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar. There is a choreo poem that's been performed many times, and it was made into a movie, let's say roughly maybe 10 to 15 years ago. Janet Jackson was in it. So for colored girls who've considered suicide, and I only included a snippet, again, another type of witnessing. So these are just to give you examples. Again, Lucy Terry piercing the veil of time then, but also now, in terms of how poetry has been used to sort of mark one's reality and their placement in society. And also raise questions as well. So here's another piece I want to give as an example, and it's one of my favorite pieces. Angels of Bread by Martin Espada, who is a lawyer, fought for social justice, and also wrote this great poem and many other poems as well.
Beautiful Brooklyn, please give a warm deaf poetry welcome to Martin Espada.
Imagine the angels of bread. This is the year that squatters evict landlords, gazing like admirals from the rail of the roof deck or levitating hands in praise of steam in the shower. This is the year that shawled refugees deport judges who stare at the floor and their swollen feet as files a stamp with their destination. This is the year that police revolvers, stove hot, blister the fingers of raging cops and nightsticks splinter in their palms. This is the year that dark-skinned men lynched a century ago returned to sip coffee quietly with the apologizing descendants of their executioners. This is the year that those who swim the borders undertow and shiver in boxcars are greeted with trumpets and drums at the first railroad crossing on the other side. This is the year that the hands pulling tomatoes from the vine uproot the deed to the earth that sprouts the vine. The hands canning tomatoes are named in the will that owns the bedlam of the cannery. This is the year that the eyes stinging from the poison that purifies toilets awaken at last to the sight of a rooster-loud hillside pilgrimage of immigrant birth. This is the year that cockroaches become extinct, that no doctor finds a roach embedded in the ear of an infant. This is the year that the food stamps of adolescent mothers are auctioned like gold doubloons, and no coin is given to buy machetes for the next bouquet of severed heads in coffee plantation country. If the abolition of slave manacles began as a vision of hands without manacles, then this is the year. If the shutdown of extermination camps began as imagination of a land without barbed wire or the crematorium, then this is the year. If every rebellion begins with the idea that conquerors on horseback are not many-legged gods, that they too drown if plunged in the river, then this is the year. So may every humiliated mouth, teeth like desecrated headstones, fill with the angels of bread.
Entering the world of Lucy Terry Prince, just to set a little bit of context so you know what was happening in the colonies during the time that Lucy Terry Prince was living in the area, living first in Deerfield, coming from Rhode Island, what we know now as Rhode Island, and then eventually with her husband here in this area right in Guilford. So here's a snapshot of the 1700s and 1800s right in this area. You have the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. You have 1775 to 1783, you have the American Revolutionary War. I believe a couple of Lucy Terry Prince's sons were part of that and fought in that. In 1778, you have Ethan Allen, who is also part of the Green Mountain Boys militia, which most of us probably know about, returns to Vermont after being held prisoner by the British for nearly 3 years. Allen was caught when he tried to unsuccessfully capture Montreal. So it was a bit like the Wild Wild West here in terms of a lot of fighting and settling, snatching land, claiming land, etc. 1781, you have Judah Spooner and Tim Green began publishing Vermont's first newspaper, the Vermont Gazette in Westminster. You also have, during all of this, Vermont not yet becoming a state until 1791. So Vermont finally becomes a state, an official recognized state. There are a couple of moments that Lucy Terry Prince is arguing before the highest courts in Vermont, and some of that is happening before it's officially a state. Also, during the 1800s, you have something called the Great Awakening sweeping through the colonies. People wanted to develop more intimacy with God, wanted to be more emotional, not like the Puritans, but kind of break away from that tradition. What you should know is that there have been allegedly several awakenings that have happened in America. This is just one of them. I think there have been like 3 or 4 different iterations of them. And it sounds exactly like an awakening, people kind of breaking from current spiritual vogue. So we have 1724 to 1726. Those are the assumptions of when we think Lucy Terry was born, most likely in West Africa. There's very little that we know about her life. Gretchen Holbrook-Gerzina actually wrote a book about the princes, and a lot of what was dismantled in terms of some of the myths around both Abijah and Lucy were dismantled in that book. Very well, actually, well researched. 1728 to 1730, Lucy arrives in Bristol, Mass., again now known as Rhode Island, and she is eventually brought to Deerfield, Massachusetts, to a couple, the Welleses, and you can still see that house actually as a part of historic Deerfield. They were a childless couple. I believe Lucy arrived there when she was between maybe the ages of 4 and 6 years old. In this area, in New England, and specifically in Mass, they referred to slaves as servants. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, because there are some differences in slavery, some nuances of differences that we learn through the lives of the princes and through Gretchen's book in terms of some of the rights, and that's probably not the right term to use, but some of the things that slaves were allowed to do up north versus what was happening in the South. So in 1735, Lucy is recognized as a resident of Deerfield. She's baptized. That's actually a very key context to maybe perhaps trying to understand the poem that she wrote about the massacre, is that she was of the Christian faith because she was baptized. Also, she was a well-known orator. She's memorized most, if not all, of the Bible, and she would work in the tavern as a part of her duties as a slave, where she was in Deerfield, Mass. In 1746, Lucy is about 22 years old when she documents the Deerfield massacre. Now, we're not quite sure if did she witness it or did she hear people talking about it, but she documents it in the poem that I'm going to recite for you guys tonight. And it's in the form, like I said, it's ballad, stanza, heroic couplets. There's a lot of rhyming. It allows us to commit it to memory. The poem survives in oral tradition for about 100 years before it's seen in print. And then finally, it is in print, 1854. Barr's Fight is first published in the Springfield Daily Republican. You also have Phyllis Wheatley. She's a Boston slave. She publishes the first book of poems by an African American. Lucy is in her late 40s by the time that Phyllis Wheatley publishes her book. There's also a few other facts, too, that people should know about Lucy Terry Prince. She most likely, I want to say within 10 years of witnessing the massacre, marries Abijah Prince. Most likely she met him while she was working in the tavern. There were white and black soldiers who passed through the tavern where she was working as a slave. They had about 6 children together, and after they eventually became freed, they moved to this area, specifically to Guilford, and had their own land, which was rare during that time. They also faced a lot of racially charged biases and harassment. So what Lucy Terry Prince did, a couple of times that they have on record, it's usually misquoted that she went to the Supreme Court, but she in fact went to the highest court in Vermont to argue for her land rights and to argue for protection, and she won her cases. So a little bit more to know about slavery in New England through Gretchen's book, Mr. and Mrs. Prince. We learn things like slaves were allowed to bear arms as they were trading most of the time, if not all of the time, on behalf of their masters, crossing state lines, some of the things that you just would never hear of through the lens of Southern slavery. Also, a lot of things tend to be tilted towards learning about Southern slavery, but not necessarily slavery in other parts of the country. And the North did indeed also have slavery. It's very complicated. So I'm going to perform Bars Fight for you. So there are a couple of things just to keep in mind. Bars, which I think most of you already know, not in terms of an actual modern day bar fight, but in terms of bar, in terms of the colonial term meaning meadow. Also, it is based on a true incident that happened with 60 Abenaki under a French commander. They approached the village and they were looking to take captives. And they settled on an area that had 2 houses, kind of away from everything else. The poem outlines what happened to 2 families during this particular event. August twas the 25th, 1746. The Indians did in ambush lay, some very valiant men to slay, the names of whom I'll not leave out. Samuel Allen like a hero fought, and though he was so brave and bold, his face no more shall we behold. Elizur Hawk was killed outright, before he had the chance to fight, before he did the Indians see, was shot and killed immediately. Oliver Amsden, he was slain, which caused his friends much grief and pain. Samuel Amsden was found dead, not many rods off from his head. John Sadler fled by water, and thus escaped the dreadful slaughter. Adonijah Gillette, we do hear, did lose his life, which was so dear. Eunice Allen saw the Indians coming, and thought she could escape by running. And had not her petticoats tripped her, those awful creatures would not have caught her, and Tommy hawked her on the head, leaving her on the ground for dead. And young Samuel Allen, oh lackaday, he was taken and carried to Canada. That's in the poem. So there are some very hard questions I've had to ask myself in the process of, I don't like to say that I'm being Lucy Terry Prince because I'm not really sure what that would look like, especially given that we don't know much about her life. I would not want to disrespect who she really was versus who I am, and how do we close the gap even though we share the same skin color. What does that look like? So I struggled tonight about whether or not to dress in costumes, similar to costume that I wore during the Brattleboro Lit Festival, and I still don't have an answer for that. So the jury's still out. It feels weird to use the term appropriation, but there is a level of appropriation, especially because I'm also engaging an audience around learning about her life and not necessarily acting her, but just transmitting her words, the very few words of hers that we know. So that's just a little bit of a note and just full honesty and transparency in terms of my struggles, in terms of learning about Lucy Terry and the deeper research I try to do about her and the work that I do around engaging everyone about learning about her life and learning about her poetry. So I would like to use this opportunity to open up to questions and also key points that we may want to talk about, whether it's the role and power of witness, could be talking about the naming, because there's definitely a clear naming that she does. And again, keep in mind, she was a slave at the time that she wrote this. So that's just interesting perspective to keep in mind. So I'll stop talking and open up to conversation and audience.
I came early and I apologize for my coverage,
Yeah.
but was her family able to stay in Guilford generationally? Did she have descendants in the
So that we don't know. There was, oh my God, it's kind of mixed. We know that her children went on to continue living in the area. She had to fight for the other piece of land that they had, I believe, in the Sunderland area. But in terms of descendants, that is not very clear in terms of whether or not they just died out or somehow. And also, too, there's another complicated question about her descendants in Africa, because she was taken from Africa. So who might be her descendants there or anywhere where people might have landed?
But you don't, was she able to live out her life in Guilford?
Yeah, she was able to live out her life right in Vermont.
And any of her children?
My understanding was that most of her children were able to live out here, but then it becomes, from what I recall from Gretchen's research, that it kind of trails off in terms of not knowing what happens to, as life usually happens, right? Like children dying off or maybe moving out of the area. But we know she lived to a ripe old age, I think maybe in her 90s, but I'd have to triple check that. Could be. That'd be very interesting. Thank you.
What kept the poem alive for 100 years before it was actually printed?
That's a very good question. And when I gave this presentation, a different iteration of this presentation last time, well, paper was very expensive during that time, rare. Someone mentioned a theory that maybe the slave master could brag about the fact that his slave knew, and they probably taught her how to read and write. Then this was probably something that was saved and then rediscovered, but we're really not quite sure. But the style, I'm not really sure to answer that question. It could be just how bizarre in terms of tone, in terms of the story. Like, she's talking about people who are getting killed during a massacre. And there's sort of a melody to it. It's like kind of serpentine in the way that it twists through the whole poem. And maybe that was something, sort of like a myth or a legend that people might repeat. And that would be my guess in terms of why it had appeal. Much like the fairy tales that got repeated. That would be my guess. And another guess could be that maybe someone rediscovered it. I'm not quite sure. Thank you.
Also, I'm struck by, because it's like the newspaper report, but it's done in couplets.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's this very interesting mix of just sort of, here's the facts, but done in this poetic style, sort of a gruesome relay. I do also know that there was a lot of people memorizing things and speaking them in some eras back there.
The oral tradition was very prominent back then, for like you say.
Write the fairy tales and
but
repeating
also
things.
The printing press came, but still it was esoteric, and oral tradition is very common.
Yeah, no, those are good points. Well, and paper was expensive, so it's not like everyone would have necessarily have known how to read, wouldn't necessarily have had a book, because books were expensive, and of course print becoming new. And so all of those elements all combining for the, I mean, even the fact that Lucy Terry Prince memorized the Bible, like, or at least large sections of it, which is very fascinating. A different time.
Yeah, I also wonder if, like, this was an event in which people felt a very important event, so that there would have been
The massacre?
every year, or I mean, you know, that there would have been occasions that maybe this massacre was being remembered.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. As one of the sources that I looked at had mentioned this being one of the very few documentations of the massacre itself. Again, I don't want to go on record and say that that is for sure. I'd have to do some more digging. But the fact, I think, true to what you're saying, it being a historical event and something that happened would have lent to it being then repeated among families, through children, and through generations. Thank you.
When it was finally published in the Springfield Republican, was her authorship, was she given credit for having written the poem, and was there an understanding that she was a slave? I mean, how much do people 100 years later know what they were looking at?
That's a very good question. I believe she was given, I believe the credit was attributed to her. Interestingly enough, there are other pieces of poetry that they're not sure whether or not it is Lucy Terry's, because again, it would have been her getting a hold of paper. And let's talk about the slave piece for a second. Does anybody notice how names are used in the piece? The fact that, I mean, again, and I'm not quite sure of this, her name obviously would have had to have been given if she was taken from Africa. So the fact that she did not have the ability to quite name herself, and in this piece, she names people and talking about how they died, which is very interesting. And then, of course, wrapping up the ending of someone being taken captive. Now, I'm not sure to what I can't quite speak on her specific feelings around her own captivity. There's another slave woman in the same area of Deerfield, Mass, who always wanted to go back to Africa, who was friends with Lucy and a part of the slave community there. But again, so little is known about Lucy's own personal feelings, and I sometimes wonder if that's sort of getting at her perception of her captivity in that piece. Hi.
Thank you for continuing the story of Lucy Terry Prince that I played in 1990s with a Vermont, with a Vermont as a Vermont juried artist, and I took Green Street School kids down to Deerfield in costume, that it was custom made by Diana Bingham. So it was a very wonderful time to do that and then followed up with Daisy Turner, of course. But to follow up with your role and power of witness, her descendants there are still descendants of Lucy Terry Prince that I was able to research, and there is a prince, they're very prominent on the island of St. Croix, the Virgin Islands, and both Colin and I know them very well. He's worked with the princes in St. Croix, and so that was very interesting. After, you gotta go back to the roots, sort of. So
How
that
did
was
you
wonderful.
find them? I'm just curious. How were you able to trace them back?
I was working with the Katrina, who did research on traces of the trade of slavery, where they dropped off different people, and many people at that time, when their siblings were able to get a little bit more liberation, like her son who went to Williams, and when she fought with Chittenden, who came out and supported her with Governor Chittenden at that time, and they left the area and migrated like we do. And they ended up in the Virgin Islands, probably trying to figure out where she was originally from, which we believe was Senegal, so Senegalese. So that is it. And when the Traces of the Trade video came out, the whole thing, and I worked with that, and they talked about where they put people across the world, in the Caribbean, and those trying to go back to West Africa, and one of the areas in St. Croix. She came up as the princess, and so they're there, and they're very well, and there's a street called Prince. It's a very prominent area on the island.
That's an excuse to go visit the islands for sure. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Any questions or thoughts or? So, which, Naeem, I probably might tap you to help me with the research pod for sure. So, as a part of this whole project, and I'll leave up my contact information just in case people want it, each of us who are part of the People's Places and History of Words project, we're taking figures, literary figures in the area, and doing research so that ultimately we can create a podcast or several podcasts in relationship to the particular people we are researching. So I'm going to be doing Lucy Terry Prince, and I'm definitely looking for other volunteers who would like to participate. And it could be any range of things. There's also a book that's going to be coming out, I believe in is it 2020 that the book is coming out?
Yes, I believe that's the
Projected date, if all goes well. There's a book coming out in which people have taken different chapters and they're writing about, and it'll be a whole People's Places and History of Words book that marks the project itself. All of this is a part of the National Endowment of the Humanities grant that we've gotten for the next, the group, 3.5 years, three and a half years, so long-term project. But hopefully that there will be something very tangible that we can leave with the area, and that will allow other people to continue to add to it and learn about all these figures that we're researching.
Just one more point. She is listed in the book. It's a book called Black Women in America. There's several volumes, and she is listed as a poet that did Bars Fight in that book. That I took the whole series and I put them in West Africa because that's where they belonged, in a library that we built with Brattleboro help. So, but she did get that acknowledgement in that particular series, and the books are in Africa.
Were you able to find out if she's done other writing? Because that's the one thing that I could not figure out.
Okay. Well, I think there was that whole discussion between her and Phyllis Wheatley, whether or not who came first. That sort of, but they put Phyllis Wheatley, but then under that they did mention Lucy Terry Prince, and because of the period in America at that time, that's why they kept it in a historical perspective, and that particular poem was the only one that basically came out. Now, if you want to channel her, you can certainly, like we did, Daisy.
We're not going to play that game. I think that was another awakening period in America. Channeling people, you get in a lot of trouble with that. And anyway, anybody else? Any questions or thoughts? This is still very much a work in progress, yes.
How did you get into this topic?
Well, as a lot of things in my life. So Lissa, actually, I have to give Lissa a shout out. She's right now doing a training for teachers for the project. She came to me last summer, and no, it was before last summer. It was last spring. Melissa and I are friends, and she said to me, do you know about Lucy Terry Prince? She should be known in her own right. Everyone knows about Abijah Prince, but not Lucy Terry Prince. And I know there are children running around with Abijah's name, and we have a road and all of that, but I didn't know much about Lucy Terry Prince. So it prompted me. Then she came to me and she said, I'm going to be working and pulling the group together for a part of this grant, and would you like to help? Either do you want to put the exhibit together, because there's also a mobile unit, an interactive unit that will be interchangeable. And it started with Lucy Terry Prince. She said, either you want to do that, or would you like to be, do something with Lucy Terry Prince? And I'm just sort of like, oh no. I've only recitated a few times in my life. The last time I recited something, it was Hamlet, to be or not to be, the soliloquy. And I was graded on it. So so I said, well, I'm willing to stretch my creative muscles. I definitely identify with Lucy Terry Prince in the sense of the use of voice. I decided to take on the challenge and be involved with the project and challenge myself to not only memorize the poem, but learn more about her life, and also try to make it relevant to today. Like the whole idea of witness and calling forth or bringing forth what it is that we're seeing is very important. Doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of a poem, as we all know, but how is it that we engage in witness? And it has reinforced what I believe about voice and the strength of voice through this project. So that's an answer to your question. I didn't necessarily go search it out. I guess you could say Lucy Terry Prince found me. And that's cliche, but that's the only answer that I do have. But thank you for that question.
Hi, could you talk a little bit more about poetry of witness and, for example, the difference between poets who write poetry of witness based on their own experience and what they see, as opposed to newspaper accounts or other sources that you write poetry of witness?
I think I'm going to tap on you for that. Why don't you answer her question? He actually, this is my husband. I'm sorry to put him. He just actually taught a whole course about poetry of witness, and while I can talk about it from one angle, I think you'd probably want to take that question.
Well, I'll try to answer it simply without pretending I can be too complex about it. There's a difference between direct observation and paying attention to the news and history and so on. And as a poet in my own life, I've lived through events that I experienced directly that I've written about. And I've also lived in times that I've written about as somebody who absorbs the news, and kind of, I haven't been to Puerto Rico since the hurricane, and at the same time I can read about that and write about the sort of wanton kind of indifference to the suffering of that colony of the United States. I did live in the Philippines during the revolution in 1986, directly could write about what I saw when I was there. I think both are valuable. I think in some ways the idea of witness is simply paying attention wherever you are, and not sort of but immersing oneself in one's own in one's own reality to the exclusion. It's almost like Mahayana and Hinayana Buddhism. I mean, the idea of sort of dwelling within yourself and seeking nirvana versus actually having compassion for the world and trying to act within it while also trying to seek some sort of inner peace. But that was a real setup, Shanta.
And I would have to say, just add to it, there may appear to be difference between a news story and a poem on the surface, but underneath, what's really going on is seeking the truth. And that's at least how I would frame it. A journalist's and I've just recently covered a story, see the seeking of the truth and pulling back the curtains, and what form are you using to do that? You know, whether or not you're using a poem to do it, or are you just sticking just to the facts? So that's what I would add to that. I hope that answered you. And I cheated, sorry, called a friend.
You made a deliberate decision not to appear in costume tonight, and I wondered what your rationale was for that.
Okay. The first time I put the costume on, and so this is divided opinion. Someone actually just sent me a video of an African American woman who wears costume to get in contact with her heritage. It's like a bridge to her lineage. And I certainly respect that. And I don't disagree, and I'm not against that. When I wore the Lucy Terry Prince costume, I found myself making it very clear that I wasn't acting or being Lucy Terry Prince, but I was enacting bars fights, while also trying to engage the audience and maybe bring them into that specific moment of time. But there also, like I said, there started to feel like some level, I don't want to call it appropriation, but it feels, is it or could it possibly be that way? You know, in terms of how I would interpret what she's going to wear or be versus who she actually was in life, and then bridging that gap. I may decide for another thing to wear costume, but it just, there's something about it that I'm still trying to wrap my head around, to be quite honest with you. And I've done it for the literary festival, but I don't think I've done it since. That's a very good question. Did that answer your question?
I'm just tagging along with the conversation. It just seems to me that, so I'm wondering if you are exploring the idea that maybe impersonating, by wearing a costume, that impersonating her isn't the exact relationship that you're seeking to have with her.
Okay, so what she asked me, or the statement she was making, is impersonating Lucy Terry Prince and having on the costume might not exactly be the relationship I want to have with Lucy Terry Prince. And so I'll tell you one thing that I thought was so, for lack of a better word, very cool. Some Marlboro College students, they did a dance performance interpreting the life of Lucy Terry Prince as a part of the Brattleboro Literary Festival. I wasn't able to get them to be a part of this, but they did a dance interpretation. They spent a lot of time, and I talked to one of the young women who led it, thinking about who would she be if she existed now, and they used a remixed hip-hop song, and they did it. They did some spoken word with it that was their own, and she did a dance piece, and it was just very inspiring. And true to what you were saying in terms of that might not be the relationship I want to have, it may not, in fact, be the relationship. I feel like I want to channel her fierce. She was fierce. She was fierce going before the highest court of Vermont and fighting for her rights as a black woman who was a former slave. There was no one who couldn't tell her she didn't have access to those rights. And I think if I could borrow anything more than just a costume, I want to tap into the strength of that voice. And I hope I could pen something that would make its way through time like that, but then be relevant. Because it may not so much be the massacre, but her strength of voice and just who she was, even what I don't know about her, just knowing that she was an orator and she fought for her rights. She was an activist and an advocate, more importantly. So I think I'm still trying to wrap my head around that, and that would probably be more close to accurate of how I want to try to channel Lucy Terry Prince. I don't want to make it, and cartoon isn't a right word either, because I don't want to disrespect people who do that. Everyone has a different, and I should say this as a disclaimer because I don't want it getting out that I'm saying anybody who dresses in costume is impersonating. That's not it at all. I think everybody has a different relationship with the historical people that they are researching. And so for me, I'm not sure yet what that is. And it was very bold to be able to say it tonight because I wasn't sure. I was just so unsure, and I thought I should just name it and say it. And in interest of what, is it Philosophy Week this weekend? So I'm asking myself some really tough questions around this research and to truly do justice to this woman's legacy. Any other questions? Or thank you, Sarah. Any other questions or thoughts?
There was something you said a little bit ago that just reminded, in terms of that part about voice and names, and I guess it was like a YouTube video or something that I saw watched one time that was kind of, this piece of it was Say Her Name.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Just that sense of that aspect of voice and names and these, I think they were all African American women, or maybe just women of color in general.
The women who had been killed by the police. Yeah.
And just that aspect, and part of that, my memory is that in it, like the person who was leading it said the name, but then asked the people in the audience to say the names. And that aspect of memory, by naming, by saying the names, you know, doesn't just fall off the front page. Some of those were never even on the front page of the paper, but I mean, you know, just that.
The whole idea, and also too, there is something I should bring up, and I think I've mentioned it before. Whenever I've talked about witness, naming is a double-edged sword. When you name, you also are maimed or potentially maimed and harmed. Meaning the people or the person who does the witnessing and calls things out aren't always the people who are rewarded for such things. So it's a very interesting relationship to witness and the role that we play or choose not to play in what we see and calling things out. But thank you for bringing that up. It's a really interesting.
When you talk about witness, is it an impersonal approach? I mean,
Almost like taking oneself out?
Right, exactly. She's not putting any of her own feelings into what she observed.
So I'm going to throw the question back at you. What do you think in terms of hearing the poem? Do you think it was impersonal, or do you think that there was some trace of personal in it?
I wondered if she was just in a house looking out the window. That was the impression I got.
And I'll be honest, I get the impression either it was something that people kept talking about, and so then what she did is she penned something through her own interpretation. She acted as the vessel for that event. Or, you know, almost similar to looking out of the window. I think in this specific case, no, actually it's hard to say, because witness, you could be the person that is right there. And because it was her community, and remember, they called them servants, not slaves. And she was baptized, and she was of the community. I would say she was also impacted by what she saw. To what extent? I'm not sure what conversations were going on with that. Yes?
From the research that I did back then before I went into her persona, she was a witness to it because she was there, and there was no one else really who watched that fight between at that time. And so it was so impressive because no one else, everybody else was either fighting or moving away. So it seemed very logical that her witnessing of it is what brought out her writing skills because of that time period, what went on. But she was a witness of the fight, and that's what she wrote. According to the history, for those who wrote the book and all of the different other lectures and in the past that I've gone to about Lucy Terry Prince, and from my own understanding of reading from the book, she was the one who chronicled that fight.
And also, raises a question, because sometimes if you're witnessing something, especially nowadays, I don't know if they use the term trauma in the same way that we use the word trauma now, but in her way of witnessing something like that, she wrote about it. Not everybody, let's say, if we witness something like that or we're a part of, who knows how we would repeat, how would we say or write or tell anybody what we'd seen. Thank you for that.
She was a slave.
Right.
She wouldn't have gotten hurt.
Well, she was property.
She was property, so
Yep.
they didn't really want to harm her during that fight.
My personal experience with the point, growing up in a New England
Mhm.
town where my family had been there for generations, is it gave the event a face. You know that she probably knew every single name, every person she's reeling off. And the minimalistic but yet detail of the event. For me, my personal experience, I could just visualize the characters, the people, and,
Right.
and the event. And I was very moved by that. She gave it a face.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, substance.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Could we ask Naima about costume and the role that played when she was portrayed?
Sure, absolutely.
She had an amazing.
Hi.
Costume and
Costume? Well, I had a great costumer, professional. I don't know if you know Diana Bingham.
Sure.
Yeah. Because I was still doing Jessie Daisy Turner in persona as a juried artist, we found, she says, why don't you do Lucy Terry Prince? And I was just, sure, you know, because as a performance artist. And it was very, very well received. I still have the costume because she made it exactly, she's the one who gave me the book of Lucy Terry Prince. And everyone was saying, since you're doing that, you know, go back. And I kept going back and researching all of the other women that were in this area at the time. So it was great. It was fun. The point for me was it was fun. It felt natural. I felt her spirit, so to speak. I don't know how, I'm not offending anyone, but she was a very impressive woman, especially when she wanted to fight for her son to get into Williams College. That drew me, the educational piece that she could read.
Now, was that actually verified? Because in some of what I was reading, they weren't quite sure if that took place.
Because at that time, they weren't allowing, it was verified.
Okay.
Verified. But she, like you said, she was a very, very outspoken, and I think Daisy Turner heard that, and that's where her voice came a little bit more, because it hadn't been that far after slavery. So, but in the costume is very interesting, especially if you do the seasons. I did winter, summer, you know, before, you know, the seasons in Vermont, and it was a lot of fun, especially working with someone who knew how to do the costume.
Right, from that period.
And so it was fun.
Yeah. And like I said before, I think it's up to, like, we each will have our own interpretation and relationship to how we want to bring forth. And I'm not going to go on record and say no costume. I'm not sure. It's, you know, that's still.
For the children who were at that time here in in Vermont, getting used to seeing a person of African origin in those period times, and we took them to Grafton, and you showed them all of the, you know, you show them that environment, you bring them into that environment, which is a part of the educational tool that is needed. But I felt, and on a field trip, you know. So it was fun.
Well, it's interesting because something came up. I got a new job. I'm working with the Clemens family farm, overseeing their A Sense of Place grant. And one of the things that came up, one of the tensions to balance, and I thought it was very interesting, not making the artists that we invite to do residencies and things like that, African American or African diaspora heritage, not making them feel like they're on display for white audiences. And where's that rub in tension? And it's an interesting question. I don't quite have an answer for that. I'd be lying if I said I did. But how to balance being on display or, again, engaging with audience, and how do you immersing children, for example, into experience, but then the line over engaging versus spectacle. And, again, everybody has a different relationship to it, but it's one of those things that came up as we were talking about an artist who's going to be at the farm this summer and saying, oh, we want to, we're all black women said this. Oh, we'd like her to bring X. We want to put X on display because she's working on a really cool exhibit. And then someone, the director of this whole thing said, well, want to bring your attention to not putting a black artist on display and in that way for white audiences. So it's an interesting thing to especially in Vermont, and as we try to engage and try to have multicultural experiences around all these different topics. Well, thank you, everybody, for this evening.
Great celebration of National Poetry Month, and we do have the book that Shanta referenced about the princes, Mr. and Mrs. Prince, and we also have one that has a chapter on Lucy Terry Prince in Remarkable Vermont Women, so there are probably some other names you'll recognize in there. Also, we have a wonderful poetry display behind the screen, which you can access at some point. So thank you all for coming.